53% of Americans surveyed hadn't read a book in the previous year. Although, in 2007, 400,000 books were published or distributed in the U.S., up from 300,000 in 2006. 175,000 new blogs are created worldwide each day, and 7% of adults polled, or 15 million people, did creative writing mostly for personal fulfillment. In short, everyone has a story, she says, and everyone wants to tell it. So I was just wondering what your reaction would be to. I couldn't make. I mean, part of me did make head and tail of those figures, but the juxtaposition of 53% of Americans surveyed hadn't read a book, although the increase in the amount of books published, and of course it goes on to talk about self-publishing, but everybody's got a story to tell.
I don't know. You know, it's like, well, I don't know. I mean, in a certain way, it's like conversation. It's like what's happened to conversation. I mean, that is, you know, as I'm sure many of you have noticed, there's such a thing as conversation, and then there's such a thing as being quiet just until it's your time to talk, and then you talk, as opposed to listening to the other person. I mean, those are two things. And I think somehow there's a parallel there. I mean, that is, who wants to read someone else's story when my own story is so much more interesting? So, I don't know.
I was befuddled.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, but yeah, but that's sort of why I wrote Reading Like a Writer. I mean, that had a lot to do with it, because I would go into these MFA programs and say, and I mean, I remember specifically when I knew I was going to write the book, which was, I was in southern Mississippi maybe, and I was doing like a Q&A, a graduate MFA colloquium, and the kid said to me, okay, so what are you reading now? Which is a hard question, you know, because even if you're actually reading something, you can't think of the answer. But I did happen to remember I was rereading Crime and Punishment because of something I was working on, and I said, oh, Crime and Punishment. And they looked at me as if I had said I was reading some Sanskrit text. And I said, how many of you read Crime and Punishment? Nothing, no hands. I said, how many have read anything by Dostoevsky? Nothing. And I said, this is an MFA program? And they went, yeah. So, but it wasn't the first time something like that had happened to me.
Grace Paley was a writer you had great respect for. And I came across this quote of hers as somebody who wrote both poetry and fiction. And she said it was that in writing poetry, I wanted to talk to the world. I wanted to address the world. But writing stories, I wanted to get the world to explain itself to me, speak to me. And I thought that was such an interesting juxtaposition of that dual role of poet and narrative writer, if we want to call it. What do you make of I wanted the world to explain itself to me? What do you...
It makes perfect sense to me. I mean, practically everything I write is because I don't understand something. You know, I mean, I didn't, when I wrote A Changed Man, I'm not a neo-Nazi. I mean, I hope needless to say, but I really was very curious about why someone would become one. So that was a big part of it, to figure out what, you know, what that kind of prejudice was about, or who those people were.
Did you know Grace Paley?
Oh yeah, I knew her for years. She was, I guess I met her, I taught at Sarah Lawrence for a year, and Grace had the office next to mine.
So what was that like?
Well, as I said, you know, I said at Grace's memorial, there's a memorial for Grace. Teaching at Sarah Lawrence was the worst job I ever had. It was really unspeakably horrible. And it was the only place where my students hated me and I hated them back. I mean, it was the, you know, I've taught for like 30 years and it was like warfare for like, And Grace loved everybody, and they all loved Grace. And, you know, walking across the campus with Grace was just a revelation because she was so affectionate and so warm and so open. And these students who had just been thorns in my side would just turn into different people around Grace. So I think I said at the memorial, you know, Grace made me realize what it might be like to be a human being. I remember very clearly being like a sophomore in college, and a teacher read Grace Paley's An Interest in Life aloud to us, and I had never heard that voice ever coming off a page. I mean, I heard that voice around me all the time. New York urban women, single mothers, I knew those women, but I had never known that anyone wrote about them. So that also was a revelation. Not long ago, a young writer told me a story about being taken to dinner by a successful, high-powered agent. The agent asked him what he wanted to write about, what subjects engaged his interest. To which the young writer replied that, to tell the truth, subject matter wasn't all that important to him. What he really cared about, what he wanted most of all, was to write really great sentences. The agent sighed, his eyelids fluttered. After a moment he said, "Promise me that you will never, ever in your life say that to an American publisher." Part of what makes this story so funny and poignant, aside from the gratuitous swipe at American publishers, is that many writers might well say the same thing. They too might say that they care about writing great sentences more than they care about other more obvious aspects of their work, for example, plot. But what prevents them from saying so is probably not the fear of ruining their careers without a sensible agent to advise them. Most writers might not even realize how self-sabotaging such an admission might be, but rather the fact that to talk about sentences is to have a conversation about something far more meaningful and personal to most authors than the questions they're more often asked, such as, do you have a work schedule? Do you use a computer? Where do you get your ideas? Among the things I remember hearing when I was beginning to write was the following rule. You shouldn't, and actually can't, make fictional dialogue, conversation on the page, sound like actual speech. The repetitions, meaningless expressions, stammers, and nonsensical monosyllables with which we express hesitation, along with the cliches and banalities that constitute so much of everyday conversation, cannot and should not be used when our characters are talking. Rather, they should speak more fluently than we do, with greater economy and certitude. Unlike us, they should say what they mean, get to the point, avoid circumlocution and digression. The idea, presumably, is that fictional dialogue should be an improved, cleaned up, and smoothed out version of the way people talk. Better than real dialogue. Then why is so much written dialogue less colorful and interesting than what we can overhear daily in the internet cafe, the mall, and on the subway? Many people have a gift for language that flows when they are talking and dries up when they are confronted with a blank page, or when they are trying to make the characters' eyes speak. Once, I assigned a class to eavesdrop on strangers and transcribe the results. I decided to try it myself in a university coffee shop. Within moments, I overheard a young woman telling her male companion about a dream in which she saw Liza Minnelli arrayed in white robes and a starry crown, dressed as the Queen of Heaven. This is the old Liza Minnelli. What made the conversation doubly engaging was that the girl seemed to be romantically attracted to her friend, and was using her story as a means of seduction, unaware that he was, insofar as I could tell, gay. This fact was not unrelated to his lively interest in Liza Minnelli. Yet another connection that his companion was preferring not to make. Like this one, most conversations involve a sort of sophisticated multitasking. When we humans speak, we are not merely communicating information, but attempting to make an impression and achieve a goal. And sometimes we're hoping to prevent the listener from noticing what we are not saying, which is often not merely distracting, but we hear as audible as what we are saying. As a result, dialogue usually contains as much or even more subtext than it does text. More is going on under the surface than on it. One mark of bad written dialogue is that it is only doing one thing, at most, at once.